epitome of Malaysian intellectual and more. So if you, Dato Sri, could give him an introduction, how would you describe him, and what exactly about him that you wish to be highlighted?
Right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, moderator Farida Hanum, President Amin Azim, and distinguished Deputy Rector Zulkifli Hassan, and friends who follow this session. Let me at the outset confess that I admire the Ungku Aziz immensely as a scholar, as a teacher. I also created lots of problems for him. He had to deal with his angry students, the protests, and there's the age of students' unrest. He happens to be a vice chancellor. There were strong disagreements with him. So I'm going to give a very objective account in brief on this towering figure, a phenomenal influence in our Malaysian society, economy and politics. Now, we in our generation see Ungku Aziz as the champion of the downtrodden, the poor, the marginalized. His Rencana Kemiskinan, this series of articles, to me was virtually, it's a simple, not too academic in a thesis, but an account of his personal experience in Kemaman, in Mersing, for example, which are like a tour de force. People talk about the greatness of the country, the potential of Malaya at that time as an independent entity, but he then challenged some strong notions about development, about the progress that we claim to achieve, and say, look, there are questions that must be addressed. Grinding poverty among the mixed, particularly among the rural Malays, and this must be addressed. We virtually memorize the entire thesis about lack of capital, poor marketing, or he termed it as irregularities in the marketing infrastructure. And then, of course, the issue of middlemen, exploitation, and it also relates to the issue of land. He then introduced us to the great names. So Emerson used to say, to understand a great Renaissance figure, you must also know what he reads or what he read. Of course, it's a very wide range of interests, from the Malay classics, which I must also commend his wife, who was had an immense influence because of her interest in culture, the arts, and Malay classics. And of course, the Mathnawi of Rumi, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, other than, of course, the great economic theories. He introduced us to Samir Amin, the more left of center scholar. Introduced us to the efforts of Said Mare, who introduced major land reform in Egypt. So once he introduced these names, we had to then go to the library, get the books, and try and understand and grasp. So Ungku Aziz, in his Rencana Kemiskinan, was of course subtly critical of the establishment. He made reference to those who were great bankers. At that time, his daughter was not a central banker, but that he was telling the bankers, the economists, the top bureaucrats, the leaders who talk about figures and success stories, but sometimes fail to understand and grasp. There's a disconnect between the stark realities on the ground. So that was Ungku Aziz in the realm of economics, which I think, even personally, I must say that my initial encounter with him was always to hear him talking about poverty, about the downtrodden, about the marginalized, about the poor. And he, greatness of Ungku Aziz, he never took it as a racial equation is always poverty irrespective of race and creed. And but naturally at that time, Malaya, we face this issue of grinding poverty in the rural sector. Now, then you talk about the Renaissance man. I mean, of course, there is a book published on Ungku Aziz by Professor Bakar Hamid, his colleague, and of course Professor Literature, K.T. Joseph, and others. And there's, of course, the whole collections of his writings. So I'm a great fan. You can see virtually his writings, which is also one major, I think, contribution to Ungku Aziz is his Jejak di Partai Zaman, Footprints in the Sense of Time, which to me, I would say, both rencana kemiskinan in bahasa and footprint, which is also in English, both English and Malay, Jejak, must be compulsory reading, to my mind, to understand the society, the grievances, the problems, and the Malay mind, and the challenges that we face as a country. And the more relevant in this Jejak or footprints, because he articulated some views exalted by personalities like Zaba, Zainal Abidin bin Ahmad, a great literary giant and a thinker, who also initially talked about poverty. And Zaba, of course, to my mind, is unique because he referred to poverty as poverty in terms of material requirements, poverty of the mind, poverty in character, the akhlaq. So he extended the meaning of poverty. I got much closer to Naqib Al-Atas. And it is interesting that one of the great works of Naqib is to introduce what he referred to as the oldest known Malay manuscript, a 16th century Malay translation of the Aqaid of Nasafi. But interesting, there is Naqib's findings or contribution. But he made reference to the effort by Ungku Aziz. It was Ungku Aziz, his cousin, who in late 1984 showed me a manuscript in his personal possession, which he had recently purchased from Mr. Bashir Muhammad, a dealer in London. You see? So the interest of Ungku Aziz, this economist, talks about or made effort to collect some old Malay manuscript, and one of the manuscripts found, incidentally, was the oldest known Malay manuscript, Aqaid of Nasafi, translation. This is just an example. I mean, let me. I'm not too structured. I'm not Professor Zulkifli. Cannot complain. I'm not too structured in my initial discussion because so many things to talk about Ungku Aziz. No? Okay. He introduced books. He always made the point. Of course we got close to him. I mean, I met, I can't say hundreds, but many meetings as a student leader, quarreling with him, storming to his office, or invited for dinner in his Vice Chancellor's residence, and as the youth leader in ABIM and in the Malaysia Youth Council, invited him to be guest speakers. Even as Minister of Education, invited him for some of the training programs and seminars on educational reform, and Aziz has always been the major speaker, and although he was a bit more guarded in his position as Vice Chancellor, he always promote critical thinking, always challenge students to question some of what is called the normative understanding of issues, although he always cautioned us against more radical position, partly because he was already partly in establishment. Vice Chancellor is quite, particularly those days, very much in the establishment. But he for example, he also promote publication, very active in promoting, introducing books. René Desbrest, the French philosopher, and here, Weapons of the Weak, Scott, study in rural Kedah. So you can, to me, exception of Ungku Aziz, apparently a scholar, a teacher, but also a public intellectual. In the sense, he wanted the students to be more active, to inculcate this culture of reading, knowledge, and would even challenge some of the conservative interpretation, either of religion of our culture. Now, having said that, I had some difficult encounters, because whilst accepting the importance of the English language, there was a period when we have a large number of students, Malay students, from the Malay stream, aliran kebangsaan those days, who entered university and stuck to an entirely English program. So Ungku Aziz, of course, had problems to navigate this complex issue. So we challenge him, therefore, to take some more drastic measures to ensure that the Malay students from the Malay stream are not being discriminated. Of course, some of my colleagues, the non-Malays until now, think that Anwar becomes virtually the Malay nationalist championing the Malay language. Yes, I did, because to me it's a matter of justice. I was never anti-English. I thought English must be a very important language in the university. But to deny students who have been exposed to only Malay language in the education system, and then compel them to study English without any preparatory program, either those days a matriculation or intensive English program prior to the entrance into the universities, is grossly unjust. So we had to fight. So there was a case even storming into his office and having a dialogue, which went after years. Of course, I felt sad, because this is a great man that we respect immensely, and we had to deal with the situation, although it's not entirely his fault, because we were actually against a government policy. Now, and then I became Minister of Education. As Minister of Education, I have this quarterly meeting with Vice Chancellors. And can you imagine? I have to tell them about policies, about programs. And there was an occasion where I was a bit more critical about the declining standard of education generally, and introduced this Educational Commission report, A Nation at Risk, a United States study analysis about a risk to education, to the nation, the United States, because of the declining standards of education. So when I challenged that, of course, coming from me, much younger, I was probably about 40, and having to deal with all the senior professors and vice chancellors. But he showed a lot of tolerance and understanding and patience, and continued to have a very healthy and reasoned discourse. But the unfortunate thing that I had to do was, as Minister of Education, there was a period where, because the maximum age at that time as a Vice Chancellor or in the public office, and I could not extend. I did bring up the matter because of the age bar to the cabinet then, but then Prime Minister, the cabinet said, look, we have to change substantially the rule before we could do this, and therefore it was one of my unfortunate role as a minister to inform Professor Diraja Ungku Aziz that I can't extend your tenure as Vice Chancellor. But Alhamdulillah, we continue to have good relations, healthy debates, the issue of Vietnam, issue of Islamization. We brought in scholars like Ismail Farouqi, and which he welcomed. I brought in Yusuf Qaradawi at that time to University of Malaya, and then he gave enough support that Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi was able to meet all the senior professors in the university in a session. thing like that. Frankly, because of the initial wave of Islamic awareness and da'wah, and there was not necessarily naturally a very close affinity with Ungku Aziz, because he was a Malay intellectual that see this new trend as something not usual, not certainly not in the mainstream. In the University of Malaya, for example, you don't have da'wah. Those days, da'wah is only in the pondok. So I can understand that, but it did not cause any dissension or enmity or rancor between us. But then, naturally, I was seen to be, representing a different trend in the campus and in the youth movement. But all said and done, I would say that in conclusion, that it would be a major tragedy for this generation, for students, if you do not attempt to grasp and have some understanding about the greatness, his contribution. To my mind, firstly, of course, in economy, because he was one major pillar at that time, other than Hussein Ali, who talked about the issue of social stratification or inequality and abject poverty in our midst. The consciousness, the ta'iyya among the general student population those days change because of their effort in inculcating this awareness that these university students, should not rest on their laurels and disconnect with the stark realities affecting our population. He supported, for example, PBMUM. Just before me, they had a seminar on rural Malay problems or issues. He was instrumental in supporting it. By the time I took over as PBMUM president, then we were championing the cause of language and education and poverty and corruption. He could not be seen to be totally in support of our efforts, but he was very tolerant, having to navigate between government, which was not too supportive or a bit oppressive, and students, which was then rising in their terms of temperature and demand. So he had, I must say, that a very, very difficult tenureship as a vice chancellor. But he did not just concede like what we see today. For example, when the Ministry of Education then, or the authorities, Home Affairs, insisted that they should interfere in students' program or bar leaders from speaking, he would not consent to that. He said, within this university is my forte and my responsibility. Unless you take a major security measure, like the Baling issue, which is 1974. 1974, not 71. December 1974. I remember well because I went in because of that. So I think academics, intellectuals, university administrators must also really try and appreciate. Once you take over that sort of responsibility, you are expected to then conduct your affairs respecting academic freedom, although you are also subjected to the national laws and rules. But then you must try and preserve this, because otherwise universities becomes like a normal secondary school.
Correct.
In Kwazi's period that we had this great economic debates, it was he who initiated the great economic debates, where annually at the Dewan to Chancellor, University of Malaya, you can have all sorts of people from all parties, all walks of life, coming and debating and making sure that thousands of students listen to all views. So thank you for giving me this rare opportunity. I'm always great, excited to be back in the UIA or IIU. It is just like I feel it's a part of me And I must say that I'm very pleased because when you talk about such an intellectual discourse, is very much in tandem with the thinking, with the ideals and expressed by the great Professor Almarhum Ungku Aziz.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dato. You mentioned just now that you're sorry to Dr. Zul because you're not that structured. But actually, I understand because when you read about Pak Ungku, there's just so many things to talk about. This is an intellectual. He's also the vice president at the time. He has contribution in public, in economic, and you mentioned quite a few times just now about poverty and how he championed about that. And Alhamdulillah, I think today what the introduction that Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim has given us is basically the layout of what you will be listening more, except that in depth. So moving forward, because you mentioned that just now, he's such a voracious reader. Now, some believe that he read more than anyone else in Malaysia during his time. So my second question would be that.
And more than him.
Okay. I'm putting you guys in the top 3, inshallah. It's a good thing to be competitive on. Now, maybe Dato Sri is the main leader back here, but scratch that out. He had his love. He had his love, like you mentioned just now, for Ibn Khaldun work. Muqaddimah, he mentioned that is a must read. Jalaluddin Rumi and Al-Ghazali, and there's no doubt that this great man was a result of his obsession and knowledge with all of these scholars that he chose to shape his thinking. Now, in your opinion, Dato Sri, because most of us that watch today are students, what makes a man to be very self-driven towards ilm, that they stay curious and inquisitive for his whole life and apply his knowledge on top of that? And how do we produce more individuals of such criteria that not just love knowledge, but share them around and actually implement that in their life?
Well, Ungku Aziz, as you know, comes from an aristocratic class in Johor. So you see, we have Dato On Jaafar, the uncle, Naqib Alatas, his cousin, Hussein Alatas, another cousin. So, not only is a normal feudal warlords or aristocratic class, but they were intellectuals in their own right. Dato On, who had some also influence, immense influence of Ungku Aziz, was a great Malay, not only political leader, but great Malay intellectual, voracious reader. And you see in his lectures and writings, coming from, say, in the 40s and the 50s, to my mind, is still remarkable as a Malay thinker and leader. And I think that sort of a tradition and culture also helped mold the man, We know all of us are not really necessarily fortunate to have that sort of upbringing, but nonetheless, he should be the a figure that could inculcate the same interest and spirit within us. We came, for example, in our student days, not very many people even know who Ungku Aziz was. Then he was his vice chancellor, and then naturally people get more interested in the issues raised, and through seminars, through discussions, through debates, then we started with discussion on group discussion. We started and then choosing relevant books other than the normal university course or curriculum, than before even Usrah was introduced in this country, you see. So I think to look at purely from the upbringing of Ungku Aziz may be a bit different, because they had a unique sort of influence, which is not the usual experience or advantage to most Malay families, yeah. But then there should not be an excuse, because we are, as students, now having the same opportunity. Probably we began a bit later. They may begin when they were 10 or 11. We begin probably when we were 17 or 18. But that would not deter us from this focus and to inculcate that sort of interest and spirit. Inshallah.
Correct. I think students today are interested on discussion. We see that everywhere in social media, except that I think the source of information and the things that we use to discuss on the topic or basically the idea. I think probably that's when a lot of us get into confusion, because like in the world right now, like so many infos come at once, and there's no longer, the traits of knowledge that was used to be very appreciated back then. Now, moving forward, you smiled very widely when Dr. Zul just now mentioned about mahasiswa menggugat on how written by Muhammad Abu Bakar, and in the forward by Pak Ungku, he mentioned that there was two persons that he hoped to write an autobiography of themselves, which is you yourself and Syed Hamid Ali. And at the time, he was the Vice Chancellor of University of Malaya, and you were very strong face of student activists. I believe most student activists today, even being, we've always been told of that story. And at that time also is the time when AMSU was abolished, and then things was changed to MPP, and then come in Ungku and all sort of things. So can you share with us what was the dynamic like, between someone who held the main position in university administration with student movement, and what was it about student union back then that was so powerful, and that that student union today can emulate? And to give some context, most people usually see that student movement and administration or the government are like a contradict force. So should it stay like that? How do we move forward? How does Pak Ungku behave and show and tolerate? And how do you think it should be now? Now that we are back, student union are back, alhamdulillah.
I'm sure Ame can expound this better, but I believe that we can also share the experience of the past. One is, of course, the tradition of scholarship. People tend to confuse the fact that it is just radicalism or sloganeering, whether it's Islam or Malay culture or nationalism, but without being immersed in understanding and knowledge, not just the 14 or 21 words within Twitter, is real understanding. That would help. That's why I mentioned the space given by Ungku Aziz to the series of seminars. And we were fortunate those days too. We have Zain Abdul Wahid, Najib Al-Attas, Hussein Al-Attas, who came down from Singapore. Then we have Kuke Kim. We have quite a number of scholars that and professors who were part of the struggle, who wanted students to not necessarily to emulate them, but to create this critical awareness. So I think issue of critical thinking, to my mind, is is the essence. People view education as just assimilation of knowledge. I think we require critical thinking. The failure, to my mind, the tragedy in the Muslim world, naturally, even in our country, when you talk about Islam, is more rhetorical without a full grasp and understanding of issues of society. And so if you look at Mahasiswa Menggugat, probably it's a different tradition. People ask me, can we do this? No, not necessarily. I would say that those days there was issue of identity, issue of hopelessness, issue of marginalization. We felt that there is the sense of the society or the leadership ignoring the sentiments, aspirations of the vast majority. So issue of corruption, of people, leaders enriching themselves is not new. We could even see those days. But I think it has become worse, because in those days probably we're talking about 1 or 2 million, and now we're talking about 100 and 200 million. And so the students have a role. Have a proper understanding, get the facts right, read as much as possible, initiate discourse, challenge these norms, and then proceed to whatever necessary demands or action that you feel need to be done. Ungku Aziz was about this role. I would certainly appreciate his difficulty. How does he navigate looking at the less tolerant government with authoritarian streak, and him, a public intellectual, a social critic, who not necessarily condemn, but very critical of our economic policies, the marginalization of our societies, and some of the massive programs, the Muda scheme. I can remember lots of writings, literature that he has done, has worked, which would open up and create a better understanding and awareness. And he gave that space. Now, I think if you ask me seriously, and I did discuss this, I remember a lecture that he gave in the University Pertanian those days. And after the lecture, we sat with him for hours. And we always challenge him, Ungku. I always call him Professor. Professor, why are you not writing as much? You know, essential writings on Aziz, there is certainly a deficit with his grand ideas and schemes, understanding and scholarship. You don't find. I mean, these are, Diraja from Tanzania is a great book, but certainly is small compared to his capacity. The collection of his numerous, these are all essays and articles. His idea, his reply was standard, which I use now. I know why you're not writing. It's all here, but I'll write. So Ungku Aziz said that. By the time I was a student leader, then the youth leader, then the minister, then opposition leader. This is here, and I'll write. So if you ask me, I think I will follow Ungku Aziz. It's here, and I will write at the right time. But this, of course, a polite criticism of Ungku Aziz, because he did not, craft, which I believe would have been immensely useful our society and for my generation and your generation. But for student leaders, Brother Ame, the challenge is, of course, to create this awareness. I mean, you have limitations. If a leader is corrupt, you talk about corruption, you upset him. If the leader has the authoritarian streak or unjust, you talk about justice, they think it's a challenge to their rule. The idea is, so you must understand that. There's no two-way about it. You just like Amar Ma'ruf Nahi Munkar. Your duty is to undertake that effort to create awareness. That's why the key word, the key phrase is critical thinking and awareness.